Louisiana is a place where history breathes through every oak tree, every decaying brick, every breath of humid air. But among its many ghostly legends, one house stands apart. A plantation so drenched in tragedy and whispers of the dead that even the bravest souls tread lightly near its gates. This is the Myrtles Plantation, a grand, picturesque estate built in 1796 near St. Francisville. Draped in Spanish moss and southern charm, it appears peaceful, almost enchanting. But those who know its history speak of something else, of unseen hands brushing their shoulders, of mirrors that trap reflections not their own, of footsteps pacing empty halls in the dead of night. Over 2 centuries, this place has witnessed more than its fair share of death, murders, mysterious illnesses, and even stories of a slave woman named Chloe, whose spirit is said to linger still, her face half covered by a green turban. Some say she poisoned her master's family in a desperate act of revenge. Others insist she was framed, and now her soul, trapped in endless torment, roams the plantation searching for justice. Visitors describe cold spots where no breeze should be, piano keys pressing by unseen hands, and ghostly faces flickering in windows. The plantation has been called the most haunted house in America. And for those who have spent the night there, that title is no exaggeration. Tonight, we journey into the dark heart of Louisiana's most cursed home, uncovering the true horrors behind the Myrtles Plantation. Before the mansion's walls ever rose, the land itself carried secrets, whispered through the swaying moss and the damp Louisiana air. Long before it was called the Myrtles Plantation, this stretch of earth had witnessed violence. Native tribes once called it sacred ground, a place of burial and spiritual significance. Settlers ignored those warnings, carving fields from the swamps, unaware that some lands do not welcome the living for long. When General David Bradford began construction in 1796, the soil was already heavy with something unseen. The workers complained of hearing chants at dusk, low murmurs that came from the trees themselves. Some refused to work past sunset. Bradford dismissed them, but even he admitted strange sounds echoed through the empty property, long before any walls stood. The plantation's beauty grew from cursed soil. Cypress and oak trees framed its white-pillared porch, and the humid air carried the scent of gardenias and decay. The slaves who tended the grounds whispered that they saw shapes in the fields at night, figures moving slowly through the fog, watching, waiting. Locals began avoiding the road near the estate, claiming lanterns flickered in the windows when the house was still unfinished. They said the land was cursed, and that the spirits of those buried beneath were restless. Bradford's family dismissed it all as superstition, until their livestock began dying without reason, their crops withering despite the fertile river soil. There were no explanations, only the uneasy silence of the swamps and the feeling that something ancient and unseen had taken notice. The Myrtles had been born from ambition, but beneath the foundation, the ground still remembered what it had lost, and soon it would demand something in return. The story of Chloe begins like a whisper carried on the humid Louisiana breeze, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. She was a slave on the Myrtles Plantation during the early 1800s, serving in the home of Judge Clark Woodruff and his wife, Sarah. Described as intelligent and observant, Chloe was not sent to the fields. She worked inside, where she overheard conversations not meant for her ears. And in a world built on power and fear, knowledge could be as dangerous as any weapon. Rumor had it that Judge Woodruff had taken an interest in Chloe, an interest she could not refuse. Some accounts say she became his unwilling mistress, while others claim she was punished for eavesdropping at keyholes, caught listening to the judge's private dealings. Whatever the truth, her fate was sealed when he sliced off her ear as punishment. From that day on, Chloe covered the scar with a green turban, the same one witnesses claim to see drifting through the plantation's halls even now. After the incident, Chloe lived in constant fear. She needed to regain favor with the family or risk being sent to the brutal fields. So she hatched a plan, one born of desperation and poor judgment. On the evening of Sarah's birthday, Chloe baked a cake, mixing a small amount of crushed oleander leaves into the batter. She thought it would make the family ill, just enough so she could nurse them back to health and earn their trust again. But the poison worked too well. Within hours, Sarah and 2 of her daughters were dead. Their screams echoed through the house as the candlelight flickered against the walls. Chloe's mistake became legend that very night, and her punishment, a horror in itself. Word of the poison spread across the plantation like wildfire, whispered first among the enslaved workers, then echoed in the trembling halls of the great house. The master's wife and children lay dead, their faces pale and still, and everyone knew retribution would follow. The other slaves, terrified of being blamed for Chloe's crime, decided they could not risk her presence any longer. Whether out of anger, fear, or the desperate instinct to survive, they chose a punishment that would end her suffering, and theirs, forever. That night, under the shroud of the sweltering Louisiana air, Chloe was dragged from her quarters. The moon hung heavy above the trees as she begged for mercy, clutching at her green turban, as if it could protect her from what was coming. No mercy came. Beneath one of the ancient oaks on the edge of the property, a rope was thrown over a thick branch. Some said she confessed through her tears. Others swore she never spoke a word. The silence that followed was broken only by the creak of rope and the slow sway of her body against the night sky. By morning, the overseers had disposed of her remains in the river, as if trying to wash away the sin that now tainted the land. But water cannot cleanse what the earth itself remembers. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. Workers reported seeing a woman in a green turban standing near the oak tree, her figure shimmering in the mist. At night, the scent of oleander drifted through the house and doors creaked open without wind. Judge Woodruff locked himself in his study, claiming he could hear whispering outside his door, a woman's voice repeating his name. Chloe was gone, but the Myrtles Plantation would never be free of her. After the deaths of Sarah and her daughters, the Myrtles Plantation fell into deep mourning. The mirrors in the home were all covered with black cloth, a southern tradition meant to prevent the souls of the dead from becoming trapped inside. But one mirror, it said, was forgotten. It hung in the hallway, framed in dark mahogany, its glass catching the dim candlelight like a watchful eye. That mirror became the centerpiece of the Myrtles' next haunting. Servants began to whisper that the uncovered mirror reflected more than their faces. They claimed to see faint handprints smudged from the inside of the glass, small and delicate, like those of children. No matter how many times they polished the surface, the prints always returned, faint but undeniable. Guests who visited the plantation often commented on the mirror's strange qualities. Some said their reflections seemed to move independently, tilting their heads a second too late, or smiling when they hadn't. One visitor swore that as she walked past, she saw a woman's face peering out from behind her own, a pale figure in old-fashioned clothing, with eyes hollow and distant. Judge Woodruff himself avoided the mirror entirely. He ordered it removed, but each time his men took it down, they found it hanging in its original place the next morning. No one could explain how it returned, and no one dared touch it again. Over the decades, the house changed owners many times, but the mirror remained. Even today, visitors to the Myrtles Plantation report seeing faces trapped within its frame, the reflection of a woman in a green turban and 2 small children beside her, their forms barely visible but unmistakably there. It is said that Chloe still watches through that glass, forever bound to the family she tried and failed to save. As years passed, the plantation seemed to breathe with a life of its own, a restless, haunted rhythm that never ceased. Guests who stayed overnight spoke of footsteps echoing through the halls long after midnight, heavy and deliberate, moving from room to room as if someone were still patrolling the grounds. It always began the same way. First came the soft creak of the floorboards in the upper hallway, slow and measured, followed by the faint rustle of fabric, like a long skirt brushing the walls. The sound would stop outside a closed door, linger for a few seconds, then move on. No one ever saw the figure behind those footsteps, but everyone who heard them swore they felt watched. One evening, a guest, a writer from New Orleans researching Southern hauntings, insisted on staying in what locals called Chloe's room. He laughed off the warnings and set up his typewriter by the window. determined to capture the experience in his book. At midnight, the air turned cold. His candle flickered through the windows were shut. Then he heard it, the soft, deliberate tread of footsteps above him. He went to investigate, notebook in hand, climbing the narrow stairs. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, circling around him. Then just as he reached the end of the hall, the boards beneath his feet groaned, and the unmistakable whisper of a woman's voice brushed his ear. "Why are you here?" The writer fled the room and never returned to the house again. Days later, when he developed the photos he had taken, one image froze his blood. In the reflection of the hallway mirror behind him stood a faint figure, a woman in a green turban, watching silently. The Myrtles Plantation had many ghosts, they said, but Chloe's steps were the ones that never stopped. The parlor of the Myrtles Plantation was a grand, elegant room, the kind meant to impress visitors and remind them of the wealth that once flowed through the South. A chandelier of crystal and brass hung from the ceiling, its glass teardrops catching the sunlight during the day and flickering candlelight at night. But the room's centerpiece was a mahogany piano, old but beautifully kept. Even when the plantation stood empty, locals swore they could hear its music floating through the night. It started as faint notes, a few soft keys pressed in the stillness, like a child testing sound. At first, the caretakers dismissed it as the wood settling or drafts passing through the old walls. But the melodies grew clearer, deliberate, unmistakable. The piano would play entire songs no one recognized, sorrowful, haunting pieces that echoed through the halls long after midnight. One caretaker, a woman named Lillian, decided to test the rumor for herself. She locked the parlor doors before leaving one evening, sliding the heavy key into her pocket. At 3 a.m, she awoke to the unmistakable sound of piano music drifting up the stairs. Heart pounding, she rushed to the parlor. The door was still locked. She opened it slowly, and the music stopped mid-note. Inside, everything was as she had left it. Except for one thing, the piano's keys were still moving. Slowly, softly, as if an invisible hand were lifting from the final chord. Lillian never spent another night on the property. Over the years, others reported the same experience. Some said the melody was a lullaby, perhaps played for the children who had died there. Others believed it was Chloe, her spirit forever bound to the home, expressing her regret in the only way she could. To this day, visitors claim that if you stand in the parlor after dark, you can hear those same faint notes, a ghostly tune that carries through the house like a memory that refuses to fade. Over the centuries, the Myrtles Plantation changed hands many times. Some came seeking the beauty of the Old South, others drawn by the legends of its hauntings. But no matter who owned the house, one thing never changed: the sense that they were never truly alone. In the 1950s, a young couple named Marjorie and Thomas Winter purchased the estate, dreaming of turning it into a charming bed and breakfast. They were enchanted by the property's moss-draped trees, its wraparound porch, its warm southern air. But their first night inside told them that the stories were not just folklore. Marjorie was the first to notice it. She awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of laughter, the giggling of children echoing down the hall. When she went to check, the rooms were empty, the house silent. Yet as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something in the hallway mirror, 2 small figures running past, their reflections faint but unmistakable. Over the following weeks, guests began reporting similar experiences. They heard doors opening on their own, footsteps pacing outside their rooms, and soft voices whispering through the walls. One woman claimed she saw a lady in a green turban standing near her bed, watching her with mournful eyes. Another woke to find the imprint of a small hand on her blanket. Thomas tried to rationalize it all: creaky floors, old pipes, overactive imaginations. But even he couldn't explain what happened one morning when he went to serve breakfast. In the dining room, every chair had been turned upside down. On each one lay a single child's footprint, marked in dust. The Winters stayed for 3 years before finally leaving, convinced that the house did not want to be lived in. To this day, visitors report seeing those same spectral children playing near the grand staircase. They laugh softly before vanishing, forever trapped between the echoes of joy and tragedy that defined their home. The grand staircase of the Myrtles Plantation has always been the centerpiece of the house, a sweeping, elegant structure of polished wood and carved banisters. But beneath its beauty lies one of the plantation's darkest legends, the murder of William Winter. In the late 1800s, William Winter, husband of Sarah Sterling and one of the plantation's owners, was sitting in the front parlor one quiet evening when a knock came at the door. Outside stood a stranger on horseback asking to speak with him. As Winter stepped forward, a gunshot split the air. The stranger turned and fled, disappearing into the mist as William collapsed in the doorway. But what happened next is what keeps visitors awake at night. Bleeding and barely conscious, Winter dragged himself back into the house, gripping the stair rail for support. Slowly, painfully, he began to climb, one step after another, leaving a trail of blood on the polished wood. He called out for his wife, his voice echoing through the hall. But when he reached the 17th step, his strength gave out. He fell there motionless. To this day, no one knows who killed him or why, but those who visit the Myrtles swear they can still hear the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, followed by a heavy thud, the echo of that final moment repeating through eternity. Many guests have reported hearing the faint call of a man's voice saying, "Sarah, help me." Others claim that drops of blood appear briefly on the steps before vanishing. The air around the staircase is always colder, the shadows deeper. The Myrtles Plantation has seen many deaths, but none as tragic or as enduring as William Winter's. And perhaps that is why, even after more than a century, he still hasn't finished climbing those stairs. The Myrtles Plantation holds many secrets, but few rooms inspire as much dread as the one the locals call the Mirror Room. It's a small chamber on the second floor, its walls lined with antique mirrors collected by generations of owners, each one older and stranger than the last. Some were imported from Europe, others crafted by local artisans, but all share one unsettling quality: they reflect more than they should. Caretakers say the air inside the mirror room feels heavier than in any other part of the house. Even in daylight, the room seems dim, as though the mirrors absorb rather than reflect light. Visitors often describe hearing faint whispers as they stand there, voices that don't quite come from any direction. The longer they stay, the louder the whispers grow, until they sound like a conversation taking place just behind the glass. In the 1970s, a photographer visited the plantation to document its haunted history. Drawn by the legends, he set up his tripod in the mirror room, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. But when he developed the film, what he found chilled him to his core. In one image, his reflection was missing entirely, replaced by a pale woman in a green turban, standing just behind where he had been. In another, countless faces pressed against the inside of the mirrors, their mouths open in silent screams. He left the house that night and never returned. The negatives, later analyzed by experts, showed no signs of tampering. Today, the room remains closed to the public. Those who have entered against warnings often emerge pale and trembling, claiming they saw movement behind their reflections, hands brushing the inside of the glass, eyes blinking where none should be. Some say the mirrors in that room have trapped the souls of the Myrtles dead, forever replaying their sorrow. Others believe the glass itself has become a doorway, a thin barrier between the living and the restless spirits who still linger, waiting to be seen. Some houses creak and settle with age. Others, like the Myrtles Plantation, seem to breathe. At night, when the air stills and the moonlight spills through the cypress trees, those who stay within its walls swear they can hear it. The long, slow sound of inhalation, followed by a low exhale, as if the house itself draws breath. In 1987, a documentary crew stayed overnight to capture these strange occurrences. Their goal was to disprove the myths that had long haunted the estate. They set up cameras in every hallway, microphones in the attic, and motion sensors near the old staircase. Everything was fine until midnight. That's when the air shifted. The team's lead sound technician noticed a faint rhythmic hum echoing through his headphones. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it the wind. It was deeper, more organic. Then came the thudding, like a heartbeat pulsing through the floorboards. The walls expanded slightly, then seemed to contract as though the house were alive. Panicked, the crew rushed to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. The locks twisted on their own, and the air grew thick with the scent of old wood and decay. Camera caught one of the crew members turning toward a wall that suddenly rippled, as if something beneath the plaster was moving. Then came a whisper, soft but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." When the sun rose, the crew was found outside on the lawn, dazed and shivering. None could explain how they got there. The footage recovered from their cameras was nearly unusable, filled with static, warped shadows and a single haunting sound. Slow, steady breathing that continued even after the last frame had ended. Locals now say that the Myrtles Plantation doesn't just house spirits. It is a living entity built from pain, loss, and restless energy. Every sigh of wind through its corridors, every groan of timber at night, isn't the sound of a house falling apart. It's the sound of something very much alive, remembering the dead that made it what it is. And for those who dare to stay past midnight, they may hear the house breathe one last time, right beside their ear.